Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
I hope everyone enjoyed the weekend and everyone is having a great start to the week. Is there a better way to celebrate Columbus Day than to have David Brody dismantle, disillusion, and expose the fake history by enumerating the many transatlantic voyagers who came to America long before Columbus? Dave recently published Pillars of Enoch, which is his 15th book in his Templars in America series, and it's like about his sixth appearance on Nightlight. And you can learn more about Dave by visiting his website, davidbrodybooks.com. Hi, Dave. How you doing?
Mark, good evening. You mentioned Columbus Day, but you know what else it is? It's the 714th anniversary of the Templars being put down in 1307, Friday the 13th of October. So actually it's not only, not Columbus Day, but it's actually the Templar Day. So a good night to be talking about this stuff.
Cool. Yeah. I have to make a note of that. Okay. So that's going to tie in with some of our section about Cam's and Rivka's travel to Portugal. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So it just coincided. I was looking at my computer. October 13th. That's today. Today's the day. Friday. That's where Unlucky Friday the 13th comes from. That was an old Templar. Bad luck for the Templars, and that became part of the sort of the superstition of the day. But that goes back to 1307.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad things worked out this way. We'll have to do it, kind of make it an annual thing. Somewhere about October 12th or 13th, and we'll get to the a lot more Templar history shortly, but we're doing a rare, or I'm doing a rare Wednesday night appearance because you had a conference last night,
right?
And are more people becoming interested in these ancient sacred artifacts and the hidden history that you write about, America's real history?
Yeah, very much so, Mark. So I started doing this maybe 12 years ago and started talking about, the artifacts that evidence exploration of America before Columbus. And when I first started giving lectures and radio shows and talks, interviews like this, there was a lot of people who were like skeptical and sort of giving me the funny look and not really buying what I was selling. And now, a dozen years later, it seems like the ocean light has really turned, and lots of other people are talking about this stuff, TV shows, other researchers. And now when I say stuff like this, people sort of nod and say, yeah, it makes sense that, Columbus was here in 1492, but he was sort of late to the party. There were lots of explorers who came over before him, not just the Templars, and we know about the Norse, but Mark, you and I have talked about many of them, the Phoenicians and the Romans and the
Brendan.
Celts, Brendan the Navigator, the Celts, the Irish, the Welsh, Madoc, and we go maybe the Chinese, maybe the Portuguese. So the idea that the Atlantic Ocean is some kind of barrier, or was a kind of a barrier in ancient times, no, it was a highway, and it's the human condition, part of the human condition. William Shatner, at 90 years old, Captain Kirk, went into space today, but to seek out new life and new civilization, to boldly go where no one has gone before, that's the human condition. And ancient boats were big enough. The Phoenicians 3,000 years ago had boats bigger than Columbus had, and they knew how to navigate by the stars. And they were willing to go out. They knew the Earth wasn't flat. They weren't going to fall off the end, and they knew there weren't sea monsters. And so the idea that ancient peoples didn't go out and explore is just wrong. Now, they kept it secret, which is why we didn't learn about it in second grade history, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. So to answer your question, yeah, so a dozen years ago when I first started talking about this, it did not resonate nearly as much as it does today. Today, I just get a lot of people nodding and saying, yeah, we may not know all the details, but that makes perfect sense that Columbus was late to the North American party.
Okay, and you have more appearances at Masonic lodges. Are the Masons agreeing with what you have to say at these lectures you give?
Yeah, they keep inviting me back, so I assume I haven't offended them too much. So, the big linchpin in all this, and you still have some people who disagree with this, but I'm convinced that the Masons, the Freemasons, are basically the reconstituted order of the Knights Templar. The Templars are outlawed in 1307. We just talked about that. But you can outlaw the mafia. It doesn't mean it goes away. It just means it goes underground. So the Templars went underground. Many of them fled mainland Europe and went, say, to Scotland. Others went down to the edges of Europe in Portugal or Switzerland. But they reconstituted themselves eventually, especially in Scotland, as the Freemasons. And officially, Freemasonry does not recognize that. But when you look at some of the things that you see in Freemason Masonic ritual, for example, their youth group is called the De Molay, which is named after the Templar Grand Master. And George Washington, when wearing his Masonic apron, when he laid the cornerstone for the White House, and I believe that was the year 1792, he did that on October 13th, today. Again, he did that because it was a nod to the Templars and to the Templars being put down. But if you ask a Freemason when his birthday is, many of them will say October 13th, because when the Templars died, that's when Freemasonry was born. So it's an important day in Masonic ritual. Again, I don't think George Washington picked that day arbitrarily. In Freemasonry, there's very few coincidences. But that October 13th date, which ties back to the Templars, I think is important. So even though officially the Freemasons will say to you, no, we didn't really descend from the Knights Templar, when you start looking at it more carefully, you sort of see that there's no way they couldn't have. And there are other authorities who agree on that. A guy named John J. Robinson, who's a Freemason himself, wrote a fabulous book called Born in Blood, and he goes into the details on this. So it's pretty well established, I think, now that the Masons did descend from the Templars. And so, given that background, the Masons are very interested in my research because it does often involve the Knights Templar, and that is their legacy.
Yeah, I think Holy Blood, Holy Grail also says that there's just a continuation from the Templars to the Masons.
Right, but the difference is this Holy Blood. I'm sorry, that this John J. Robinson book, Born in Blood. He's a Freemason himself, and so you don't oftentimes get people within the craft, capital C, within the craft, coming out and saying that. So that was sort of remarkable that he did that. But yeah, other observers like myself and like the Holy Blood, Holy Grail authors, Bejant and Lee, I think his name was. What was it? Henry Lincoln, Bejant and Lincoln. You know, for them to say it is one thing, but for someone on the inside to say it is another.
Okay. So you are out with a new book, Pillars of Enoch, and it's starts off with another interesting artwork like Treasure Templari. That was your, second to last book? Or last
fourth
book?
to last. I've been writing like a banshee during the pandemic. I've been putting them out every 6 months. So that was book number 9. I'm up to 12 now. In this, there's 15 altogether, but 12 in this series. But that was, I think, 8 or 9. Okay. It's been a while. Yeah, I've been going fast.
Okay, but yeah, you have Treasure Templari was looking at Jan van Eyck's triptych in
the Ghent altarpiece, right?
The Ghent altarpiece. So let's look at this new artwork that gets the story going, and Cam, the fictional hero of your series, gets contacted and starts investigating this painting. So let's talk about that.
Right, so it starts. It's fictional, so we don't have it's not a real piece of art, but basically it's a portrait of Nancy Hanks Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln's mother. Now the official portrait of her shows her as very demure and basically like a school marm type thing, but with pale skin and brown hair, and she looks very Caucasian. Descriptions of her are different. They describe her as being very dark-skinned, kinky hair, and that's caused some people to suggest that perhaps she is of African-American descent, perhaps. The history of her, she was she was raised by her grandparents because her mother was so young when she had her, so she was just basically raised as another one of the kids in the family. But one of the possibilities is that her mother, that her father, Nancy Hanks Lincoln's father, was perhaps a freed slave, and that's sort of what sets off this whole story, this question, because a portrait is found of her. The question is, does it show her to be of African-American heritage, and what does that do to American history? And that sort of sets the whole thing going.
Okay. And you mentioned the future president's maternal side of the family was named Hanks, like
right.
Tom Hanks.
His mother's name is Nancy Hanks. Nancy Hanks Lincoln. Hanks is her maiden name.
Mm-hmm. And you say it's a pretty common name among the Melungeon people.
Exactly. So the Melungeon people are a mysterious group of people who live in southern Appalachia, and putting aside whether Nancy Hanks herself might have been African American or not, she was clearly Melungeon. And so who are the Melungeon? What does that mean? That's still a mystery to this day. There's a really interesting Supreme Court case back in the 1800s that basically rules that or decrees that the Melungeon descend from the ancient Phoenicians. That case basically was a question about that doesn't matter what that was about, but that's an interesting case. But the Melungeon people, we're starting to be able to shed more light on it because of DNA and other history. But I think the best we can say about them is that they're a mixture of Portuguese, Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews are Jews who lived basically around the Iberian Peninsula, as opposed to the Ashkenazic Jews who lived in Eastern Europe. So Portuguese, Sephardic Jews, Cherokee Indians, and North Africans. So either freed slaves or slaves from North Africa. And that's based on sort of DNA testing and other clues. But it's an interesting mishmash. The question is, how far back do you go to start getting some of these things? We'll get into that as the conversation goes on tonight. But one of the interesting things that comes out through DNA is that if you trace back Nancy Hanks Lincoln's matrilineal kin, it shows that they belong to the very rare haplogroup X1 small c. That's never been observed in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, there's only 2 cases in the world, one in southern Italy and the other in northern Africa. And so it may be that the DNA ties her back to northern Africa, again, which would make her African American. So it's an interesting thing. But it really, a lot of the book turns on this fascinating group of people known as the Melungeon, many of whom have sort of lived in isolation, trying to assimilate and get and almost hide their ethnicity, hide their differences, and try to blend into mainstream America. And only now we're starting to look a little more carefully at them. Some famous Melungeons are, you mentioned the last name Hanks, Tom Hanks, the actor, Elvis Presley, Ava Gardner, the actress. Those are just 3 of sort of the more famous people of Melungeon heritage. Cher, perhaps, yeah. Cher is another one, the singer. And they also have that same look with the dark, swarthy complexion, dark hair, curly hair. They also have that same look to them.
And another trait is 6 fingers.
Yeah, I didn't get into that too much in the book, but that is one of the sort of thing. The 6 fingers. There's a bump on the back of the head. There's other sort of recessive gene things. Off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly what they were. You might even remember what they are, Mark, because you read the book more recently than I did. But there are a few things. There are also some fascinating. I mentioned that one of the 4 groups that they may descend from are Sephardic Jews. There's some fascinating behavioral things that we see in the Melungeon communities that are very reminiscent of Jewish traditions. For example, they wear skull caps when they pray. They even though they're purportedly Christian, they observe the Sabbath on Saturday rather than Sunday. And they, again, even though they're Christian, they read almost exclusively from the Old Testament rather than the New Testament. And they get married under a canopy, which is known as a chuppah in Judaism. And they prepare matzah for the Last Supper, which is basically the equivalent of Passover. Women sit in a rear section in the sanctuary separated from the men. There are no crosses or steeples or stained glass in their prayer halls, again, similar to a synagogue. Day begins at sundown rather than sunrise, again, similar to Judaism. They don't eat pork. There's a lot of these attributes that they have. They don't really know where they come from, but if you compare them to Jewish practice, you see a lot of similarities, especially in the religious side of things. And so, the conclusion, I think, has to be that there is some connection between the Melungeon and the Jewish heritage and the Jewish religion Now the question is, how far back does that go? And that's what we need to explore that a little bit. But clearly, based on what we see in their religious practice, there's a Jewish influence in their culture.
Yeah, and since you seems like there's some Cherokee connection with the Melungeon background as well, and another sample of the cultural similarity was I forget what page it is, like around page 159 or so, where you did go into another reference to Elvis, but there was one of the characters said something about, it might have been Cam, who said something about key or Melungeon word was Yehovah, which sounds a lot like Yahweh.
Right. So we're sort of connecting all these groups together. We've connected the Jews and the Melungeons, and we can also connect the Cherokee and the Jews. There's a school of thought that says, and I'll read a quote from Dr. Donald Yates, who's president of the DNA Consultants, and he's done a lot of work on the Cherokee Indians and their DNA and their genetic markers. And I'll quote him, quote, "The essence of my findings is that the Cherokee have had families of Jewish heritage in their midst since before Columbus, and that early Jewish traders married Cherokee women to cement their ties with the tribe." So this, again, before Columbus, based on the DNA. When you do DNA, you can trace it back X number of generations to see where the fork in the road was. And he says this happened all before Columbus. This gets back to, it was all this happening because the Templars came here, and the Templars brought with them these different groups of people, these Jews fleeing Europe during the Inquisition and the North African slaves. And is this the root of the Melungeons? Okay, we'll get into that in a second. But Dr. Yates says that, but he also talks about the writings of Cherokee Chief John Ross, and he wrote this 2,200-page compilation back in 1837, right before the Trail of Tears. Basically, it's the Cherokee history. And I'll read again a quote from that. And he says, quote, "The Cherokee most sacred name of God is Yehovah, a name which no common person was ever allowed to speak. And that's just like in Judaism, where Yehovah is the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, Yud, He, Vav, He, in English, Jehovah. Traditionally, again, no one's ever allowed to utter it." So this all happens in 1837. Again, this is before the Cherokee converted to Christianity. So before they'd even really read the Old Testament, already they're referring to God as the same name, Yehovah, as is in the Old Testament for the Jews, the Tetragrammaton. So how did the Cherokee end up with the same name? So again, this is where Dr. Yates says there was a connection going way back to pre-Columbus times, where the Jews came over, intermarried into the Cherokee tribe for trading reasons, and that's why the DNA goes back that far, common DNA, and also this common practice of the name of the god. So a lot of this was legend, and now we have DNA, which makes it science. So science is allowing us to take legend and actually harden it and make us think, okay, it's more than legend. There's some fact behind that. And again, I think that as we go along over the next few decades, more and more science is going to come in and give us even a clearer picture of all these things.
Okay. Yeah, I thought the passage from John Ross's book about the language was it really makes a very convincing case, and don't mean get too sidetracked on another one of your books, but you do use language in your books to make a very convincing case, like you did with the Basque language in Echoes of Atlantis.
Right.
In the
good memory.
Ceiling was called the roof of the cave, or something like that. It's like,
right,
well, yeah.
Right.
If a somewhat modern person is talking about the roof of the cave, like how far back is like the root words of your language going?
I think the other example in that book was the Basque word for knife was stone that cuts. And that tells us that word goes all the way back to the Stone Age, because otherwise it would be metal that cuts. So that tells us the Basque word goes back, at least till 500 BC or before the Stone Age. Actually, I'm sorry, before that would have been the copper culture. It goes back thousands of years, going way back to the Stone Age. But that's a very good point, Mark, that you make there, looking at language, and it illustrates a broader point I always like to make, which is that you really need a sort of a liberal arts approach to start to understand all this, because you can't do just archaeology, for example. The archaeologists love to say, everything that comes out of the ground, that'll tell the whole story, and they don't like to look at any other discipline. But really, you got to look at linguistics. You got to look at history, of course. You got to look at, when we talk about DNA, that's science. Geology, of course, people like Scott Walter do a lot of work. Archaeoastronomy, the astronomers do a lot of work on this. You can't tell this whole story by just looking at archaeology. You need to be interdisciplinary when you do this. And you make the point, one of those things is linguistics. And so we start looking at some of these words, and they tell part of the story themselves. And you just can't. You can't ignore that kind of evidence. I'm a lawyer by trade. That's my outlook on things. And we were always taught that you have to look at every piece of evidence. That if you have a table full of evidence, you can't just take 5 or 6 of the strongest pieces and build your case around it, because your opposition is going to take the 5 or 6 weakest pieces and poke holes in your case. If you do that, you need to take every piece of evidence on that table and build a case that includes and incorporates every one of them. And so, you can't. Archaeologists love to take pieces that don't fit with their theory, and they call them outliers. And they'll just sort of toss them aside and say, well, that can't be right. We found that in the ground, but that can't be right. And they toss it away because it doesn't fit what they believe to be the truth. The lawyer cringes at that. We say you can't just do that. You have to take all the evidence and change your case theory to fit the evidence. Don't change your evidence to fit your theory of what's going on. History bends. Science doesn't bend. Science needs to be static. The history has to bend to fit the science, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. I think when Barbara and I were putting this show together, I think we were we want to move away from just the rehashing the same topics show after show, like the lights in the sky type stuff. I think this, when we formed the show like over 3 years ago, like you said, you worked in an interdisciplinary approach, and I think, that's kind of what one of the themes behind, this Nightlight Part 2 show that Barbara's allowing me to do. It's, I'm trying to bring, those kind of ideas to developing different shows each week, and I think it works.
Mark, one of the first interviews you and I did together, you did for me, you joked about your liberal arts education and how you were finally getting to use it. And, people always say, the liberal arts education, it's sort of a waste of money. But in something like this, it really does help to have an interdisciplinary approach to analyzing these problems. I mentioned 6 or 7, but it's probably 10 or 12 different disciplines that you need to be proficient in. You don't need to be an expert in, but you need to be proficient in order to really understand all this stuff. So, in this particular case, I don't want to get too far off, but what starts the whole book off is this Nancy Hanks Lincoln portrait, and the idea, is Abraham Lincoln, is he A, of potentially African-American heritage, and B, is he also potentially of Jewish heritage? Because we think he's Melungeon, and then we start tying all this together, and I'm probably going to get ahead of myself here. There's a fascinating passage I found, and I love the internet. This is so cool. I found an article from 1863, a Hebrew article in a magazine called Ha-Magid, which was published in Prussia. It basically specialized in news of Jews around the world. So this article in 1863, written in Hebrew, it exists on the internet, so the internet's a great place. But basically, let me quote from this article. It's fascinating. Quote, "The ruler Abraham Lincoln, head of government of the lands of the North in America, during a recent visit of the learned rabbis Wise and Lilienthal from Cincinnati and attorney Martin Buer from Louisville, Lincoln told them in the course of conversation that he sprang from the belly of Judah and his forefathers were Jews. And these emissaries, the rabbis and the priests, indeed report that the facial features of the president are evidence of his descent from the loins of the Hebrews." Let me say it again. He says that his forefathers were Jews. Abraham Lincoln said this when he was visiting with the rabbis. In fact, the name, of course, Abraham itself is Old Testament Jewish. His great-grandfather, his paternal cousin, and his uncle were all named Mordecai. He was the only president not to belong to a church. That was a pretty big deal back in the day. The town in England where his family came from, Lincoln, had a large Jewish population, unlike most towns in England. And his ancestors were metallurgists, which is a common Jewish profession. So there's a lot of evidence that Lincoln, again, being Melungeon, partly Jewish, had strong Jewish connections. He himself said that. So this whole idea of, President Lincoln, perhaps our greatest president, as I dug deeper into this, started finding out through his mother, through Nancy Hanks Lincoln, being probably, based on DNA, from Northern Africa, and probably also, again, based on what he says and based on his family history, also of Jewish heritage. We've got, we don't think of Abe Lincoln as that way. We think of him as just, a Caucasian. But it turns out he was a large percentage both Jewish and African American, black. So what does that mean? How did that form the decisions he made? How did that change the course of American history? And more to the point, how come we don't know about this stuff? I mean, how come those things aren't known? They would be crucial, I think, to understanding the events leading up to the Civil War, and yet we don't know about that. So that's the fun I get to have when I get to go down these rabbit holes and look at this stuff. And again, I'm writing fiction, but I hopefully raise issues that other people have not really raised and that readers will find interesting, and that hopefully in the future other historians will take a closer look at. But again, we're just starting to be able to scratch the surface of this because of DNA work as the science evolves. But to me, it's fascinating that Abraham Lincoln might have been, both Jewish and black. How cool is that?
Yeah, finding that newspaper article and having it in your book, that was on page 191. I just saw where I jotted that down. 191. That really does add a lot to the story if President Lincoln, was African American. Or you can see why he empathized so strongly, with the slaves.
Right.
And freedom on January 1st, with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Even if he himself did not know of his African heritage or his Jewish heritage, which he did apparently know of his Jewish heritage, but even putting that aside, being Melungeon, even that in and of itself, would have made him a minority, would have made him subject to stereotypes and to prejudice, would have given him sensitivity towards other minority groups. And so even that aspect, I mean, that's really not, I don't think, in any doubt at all that he was Melungeon. So even that, I think, would be interesting for us to have learned about in school. And I don't remember ever learning about that. But again, it's just, so much has been written about Lincoln, and we try to psychoanalyze him and understand, the log cabin contributed to his, the walk a mile to return a penny, and Honest Abe, and all that stuff. Yeah, that's fascinating. But there's other parts of his personality that I think we can trace back to his heritage and his family upbringing that also shed light on his behavior. And here am I, I'm just writing fiction, so I'm not a historian necessarily, but I uncovered this stuff. I wish others would try to do the same, but that's what kicks off the whole story. This whole idea, we're down in Appalachia, it's in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where the characters are set, and that kicks off the story. This whole idea that the Lincoln family, may not be what it seems, and this painting that is fictional, but in the book there's this painting showing Lincoln's mother as dark-skinned, and if that gets out, what does that do? And so that sort of triggers the adventure, that triggers the danger, that triggers the whole story. But the background to all that is this whole idea that this Melungeon ethnicity is so complicated. It's Cherokee, it's Native American, it's African American, it's Jewish, it's also
Phoenician,
Portuguese, and that ties back to the Templars. Maybe the Templars are the root of all this. No one loves the Templar, writing about the Templars more than I do. So,
but your profiling of characteristics of this group of people and this, and how all those types of behaviors may have what do you call it, become manifested in President Lincoln. It does create a fascinating profile, and it does make sense when you read the book.
Yeah, I think I try. A lot of my fiction is speculative. A lot of the stuff I write is speculative. But as a lawyer, I only write about things that I feel like I can go in front of a jury and make a case. I'm not going to say that Lincoln was, African American unless there's evidence to support it. In this case, DNA. I'm not going to say he's of Jewish heritage unless there's evidence to support it. So, to me, it's always, would I be comfortable going in front of a jury and not getting laughed at? I want to win the case, right? So, so I'm glad you said that, because hopefully you came away from the story thinking, you know what? Wow, maybe Lincoln is more Lincoln than we knew. Wait, maybe we need to look at this more. So, if you came away from that, then good. I did my job, and more importantly, I made you think. Hopefully, when you read my books, you learn something at the same time of being entertained. That's always what I hope to do when I read. And so, as an author, that's always my goal. I want to put the readers on the roller coaster ride, which I think is important. But I also want to teach them something along the way. So, a little spoonful of sugar as they're learning things. But to me, that's the kind of things I like to read, and so that's the kind of things I try to write.
Okay, and Okay, since we're dealing with the Templars, and I'm sure if a lot of the listeners have seen Oak Island, there's got to be something being brought over to Appalachia for some reason, safekeeping. That's where a lot of your books focus on that kind of transatlantic crossings. So in Pillars of Enoch, you are focusing on some artifacts that are mentioned in Exodus. Was like chapter 34, where God and Moses have their encounter on Mount Sinai. So what are these artifacts that you are hypothesizing were brought from the Holy Land to Appalachia?
Yeah, so when we look at the Old Testament, there's always a list of things that are kept, sacred objects that are kept within the Ark of the Covenant. The Ten Commandments are there, the rod of Aaron is there, the pot of manna is there, of course the Ark itself. But there's also something called the Tables of Testimony. It's a tablet. It's supposedly carved on that are something called the cosmic equations, disclosing like secrets of science or whatever. But those are talked about in the Old Testament, and then they just sort of disappear. Going forward, we always talk about the Ten Commandments and the rod of Aaron and the pot of manna, and, but the Tables of Testimony disappear from history. We never see them again. And so, here I am. This is speculative. So, I've got the Freemasons. I go back to the time of the Roman invasion of Jerusalem, when the Temple of Solomon's destroyed, and the priestly families flee, and a lot of them end up in Rome with Josephus. And how did that happen? Was some kind of trade, some kind of deal made where they were given safe haven in exchange for disclosing to certain Roman generals where the treasures of the temple were kept? One of the theories I've read about, and I get into this in the book, is that the priestly families, that Josephus basically, bought their freedom, and that they continued to be priestly families, but they had to give up Judaism, and when they went to Rome, they couldn't practice Judaism outwardly, so they sort of went underground, and they created this whole religion which is based on Judaism called Mithraism, and that allowed them to maintain their sort of cult of the priestly families while in Rome. And I theorize, and this is just the speculation, that they ended up with this Tables of Testimony, this tablet made of lapis lazuli, and inscribed on this was the cosmic equations, because basically there's, it sort of disappears after the Roman put down of Jerusalem in 71 AD or 73 AD, whatever that is. It just sort of disappears from history. And so this is speculative, but it ties into what other writers have written about this whole idea that Freemasonry may trace its roots all the way back to the priestly families from Jerusalem. What happened to them after the put down, and could they have given rise to Freemasonry? And so that's what I get into a lot of that. There's sort of different things that trigger the story in the book. One is the Nancy Hanks Lincoln. A second one is this idea of these priestly families reconstituting themselves later on, both first as in Mithraism, and then later on as the Templars, and then after that reconstitute themselves again as the Freemasons.
Okay. Yeah, it's all very interesting. There's actually a lot said about these treasures. Like the table of shrew-bread.
Right. That's another one.
It's like a lot. Yeah, just like a lot of people. When I go through the Bible, it's I kind of miss things like that. I was kind of looking for, I don't know, like more of the grand entrances of some of the main characters, or something like that. I just kind of always miss these like table of shrews bread that you bring up. But you go back to the Bible, and okay, there it is. Just like the golden menorah lampstands from.
Yes. Yeah, another one that we see it. It's on the Arch of Titus, carved on the Arch of Titus in Rome. So we know it made it that far. Again, this is the golden menorah that you just mentioned, but we never see it after that. So we know that the Romans took it during King Herod's war in 70 A.D. when they were victorious, and they paraded it down, through Rome, and that was memorialized in this carving. But then what happened to the golden menorah? It's one of the most sacred objects, and no one's seen it since. So, it's similar to the tables of testimony. No one's seen it since. Has to be someplace. So maybe the Templars have it, and if so, it's fun to speculate as to what they might have done with it. Possibly, knowing the Templars, knowing they were going to be put down by the church, they might have spirited it away across the Atlantic to a place that was a safe haven, a good place to hide it that only they knew how to get to. They had built alliances with the Native American tribes, and the tribes sort of served as, custodians of those artifacts. That's speculative, of course, but that's one possibility.
Okay. Okay, since we're talking about the, what was on the table of testimony, you also do work in a similar topic from the Hopi culture into your story. Your character Astarte is gets involved with the Blue Star prophecy.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about that topic, and I think the audience would see there's some kind of similarity with this idea of cosmic equations.
Right. So the Blue Star prophecy, that's something that actually Barbara turned me on to. There's a book written by Paul Laviolette called Earth Under Fire, and Laviolette believes that there's this at the galactic core, that there's this blue star that at some point is going to explode, and that that periodically over the course of human history it has done so, and that ancient cultures, through the zodiac signs, in particular Sagittarius and Scorpio, they're the only two constellations that have arrows or pointers. And if you look at sort of the intersection point where Sagittarius is pointing his arrow sort of across the sky, while Scorpio's stinger is aiming like up, basically vertically, and where they intersect at really the dark galactic core, but that during this galactic explosion there'd be a blue light there, and that this was sort of a sign from ancient humans, perhaps the Hopi culture, who survived these explosions, these massive, terrible events, these catastrophes, these cataclysms. They probably survived them by being up in their cliff dwellings, again, high enough up for the floods, but also to go deep into the caves to survive the heat of the fires that would happen during a cataclysm. That the Hopi survived this, and these happen periodically over every few tens of thousands of years. But Laviolette theorizes that the next one is coming imminently, and that we need to take preparations, but that the signs are there, that again, the ancient peoples have left the Sagittarius and Scorpio zodiacal signs as a warning. If you look up there, you can see what's going to happen. So in my book, Astarte, who's of Native American heritage, readers will know about her. I won't get into too many details about it now, but she is approached by a Hopi elder who says, I've been studying this and we think it's going to happen again, and we need your help because Astarte has been prophesized to be this Native American spiritual leader. We need your help getting the word out, to warn people, to get ready for this, to go to high ground, to go back to the caves, to get away from the floods and get underground to survive the heat. But that ties in, as you said, to some of this other science, these cosmic equations, and these things have happened. These cataclysms have happened periodically over the course of human history. These tables of testimony. The tradition is that these were hidden. These tablets were secreted and hidden in pillars called the Pillars of Enoch. That's where the title of my book comes from. That they survived the Great Flood because they were hidden inside these massive pillars, and that's the tie-in between what's happening with Astarte's prophecy, this blue star prophecy, and what's happening with these tables of testimony that we think the Freemasons may have be in possession of in Asheville, in the Masonic Lodge, Masonic Temple in Asheville, North Carolina.
Okay, and I thought it was
Which is
really
fiction, by the way. That part is definitely fiction. I don't think the Freemasons in Asheville, North Carolina, have the tables of testimony. that is that's just a part of the story that is fiction.
But they do have a Masonic temple there?
Yes, they do have a Masonic temple there, correct.
Okay. Okay, so with some of these cosmic equations, you do work in the Fibonacci sequence and
Fibonacci sequence, yeah, which is really cool. It's a really I don't know if you've studied that before. Very cool.
I'm a little bit familiar with it, but you do have the photo of exemplifying it within the Vatican staircase.
Right. So if you think about it, what the Fibonacci sequence is, basically you take a series of numbers that we'll start with. It goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. So if you take 5 and 8, you add them together, you get 13. So then 8 and 13, the next number would be 21. And then 13 and 21, the next number is 34. 21 and 34, the next number is 55. And if you graph that out on a two-dimensional grid, you end up with a spiral that looks almost like a snail, or a spiral staircase that's not uniform. It's not uniform in diameter, but it starts getting wider and wider as you go out to it, or almost the shape of a tornado forming, that same kind of spiral. And so that happens all over in nature, and that's called the Fibonacci sequence. And the other thing that's really interesting is if you take those numbers, let's take, for example, the 13, 21, 34, if you divide the bigger number by the small number, any one of those, you end up with 1.618 to 1. The ratio is 1.618 to 1 all the way through. And that 1.618 to 1 is called the golden ratio. And you see that interior designers and architects use that all the time when they're designing buildings or furniture. For some reason, the human body, the 1.618 to 1, that ratio exists. Whenever you see a beautiful face, it's because those ratios are in play. So, for example, the ratio of the top half of your face from your nose up to your nose down to your chin is 1.618 to 1, and the width of your eyes compared to your nose and all that. Those ratios always hold whenever we see something beautiful, whether it be in architecture or in the human face, that ratio holds. So architects and designers always try to build and design using that ratio, but it's based on the Fibonacci sequence. So that, I don't think that is the cosmic equation. But that may be one of the cosmic equations that was carved into this tablets of testimony, that sort of tables of testimony that sort of give the secrets of science and measure and weight and number that the ancients had discovered and passed down, and that they believed were sacred because they were given by God, and that they were, there was something special about them because they were so perfect.
It was very interesting that you just worked it in there, and it.
Yeah, but Notre Dame Cathedral is, I think, the example I give in my book. That's built using the 1.618 to 1 ratio. So all the great cathedrals are built using that. And of course, the church doesn't realize that really what they're doing is, it's almost pagan in a way. It's a nod to nature, in the sense that, it sort of ties nature back to God, which is if you're a humanist, that's a good thing. But I think the church, if they were to realize what they were doing, you mentioned the spiral staircase inside the Vatican. I'm not sure they realize what they're doing there, that they're giving a nod out to science, which, oftentimes the church is opposed to science, choosing instead faith over science. But that's an interesting intersection point between science and religion, this Fibonacci sequence of the architecture that exists in and around the Vatican.
Yeah, and I agree. Do note that why did the Masons want Roman architecture in the Asheville Masonic Temple when Rome was their enemy? As we kind of memorialize that today, 714 years later, but what you were just saying about some of this, the golden ratio, just say the golden ratio. It is going back to nature, which is going to emphasize sun worship, kind of detracting from the Catholic Church being built on Christianity, but there's also this possible the continuation of the same theme of the sun and the sun as in a child.
Right.
You make an interesting point there about how does all this nature stuff work into these temples, Masonic temples?
So if you see pictures of the Pope parading, oftentimes, especially in church, he's carrying a giant gold disc, which is called a monstrance, which really is the sun, the S-U-N. And so and these rose windows that we see in these great cathedrals of Europe, where the sun comes pouring in through the window, and the sun is a huge part of Catholic ritual and ceremony. And again, it goes back to the ancient sun worship. The church sort of rolled that into their worship because they know people in ancient times understood the importance of the sun. And so there's a lot of these sort of pagan things, nature worship, that are included in Catholic ritual, but the sun is the most important one of those. And, if you look at, I mentioned earlier, the Mithraism, which is what we think that the priestly families of Jerusalem sort of formed Mithraism as a way to keep their group together in a secret society. But the sun, again, plays a huge part. Sun worship plays a huge part of that. In fact, the most important day of the Mithraic calendar is June 24th, which basically is the summer solstice, give or take a couple of days. And the same thing happens in Freemasonry. And again, you wouldn't think of Freemasonry necessarily being sun worship, but it is. Again, it dates back to this goes back to its tie-in with Mithraism and back to the Druids and the Magi and all these people who were in touch with the cycles of nature and the importance of those to the human survival. And so we see that in these ancient societies, these ancient orders. And again, we see it in the church as well, even though the church doesn't like to talk about it very much. But a lot of this manifests itself, as I said earlier, in this Fibonacci sequence. And I try to tie that into the story. That may have been one of the things that's carved on these tables of testimony, these fascinating tablets that were given by God to Moses and were kept in the Ark of the Covenant for a long time and then seem to have disappeared, even though everything else continues to be talked about throughout, through in the Old Testament and beyond. But these seem to have disappeared. This one is gone, and no one ever talks about it again until people like me stumble upon references to it and say, wait, what's that? What is that thing? Why is that in the Ark of the Covenant, and what happened to it? I don't have an answer to that, by the way. Like, that's a question.
Yeah, and it also bring up another interesting point is, all the sun imagery in the Catholic Church, but you also noted that even at night, the stained glass windows at Notre Dame also put off unique, light. And that's another interesting mystery, like how they made like the sharp blue, and what you were talking about with the glow at night from a stained glass window. And it's another like one of those just weird aspects of history that a lot of people may not realize until someone like you brings it to their attention.
Right. People may not realize that the stained glass that's in some of these medieval cathedrals, the secrets to make that glass has been lost. We can't reproduce the brilliance of the stained glass that was built 700, 800 years ago. We can't do that anymore. Like, somehow that technology has been lost, and it's a fascinating question because we can do so much, right? But we can't seem to do that, and no one's quite sure who did that or how they learned that, but that technology is gone, and so that's just an interesting little footnote to those cathedrals.
Yeah, and since we're at a point in the discussion where we're in Europe, let's talk about Cam's and Rivka's jaunt to Portugal. Got good education from that section of the book.
Right.
Where they visit Tomar.
Yeah. So just to give a little background, so the idea that it all sort of starts with the Cherokee teachings and evidence that the Cherokee that there are Cherokee ties to ancient Jews that predate Columbus. In other words, Jewish traders were intermarrying with the Cherokee before Columbus. So how in the world could the Jewish traders have gotten to America before Columbus? And really the only answer in my mind is with the Knights Templar, because the Templars really are the only group during that time period who possibly could have been crossing the Atlantic. They had the wherewithal to do that. They had fleets of ships. They had plenty of experience in sailing, at least around the Mediterranean and up to up the coast of Europe to the North Atlantic. They had reason enough to do it. They had probably ancient maps and whatever. So who could have possibly done it? To me, it was the Templars. And likely what would have happened was, and I mentioned this earlier, is that Jews fleeing Europe during the Inquisition. I don't know if people realize that the day Columbus set sail, one of the reasons why he set sail that day was the next day was the day the edict outlawing Jews in Spain went into effect. And he had a lot of Spanish members of his crew, Jewish members of his crew. So they had to sail that day, otherwise his crew would have been arrested. And so lots of Jews, even in Columbus's time, but probably earlier, jumped on ships as a way to escape the Inquisition, as a way to escape poverty, as a way to escape persecution, as a way to escape all sorts of horrible things going on in Europe at the time. So under the scenario in which the Templars somehow found their way to North America in, say, the 1300s and 1400s, it makes sense that some of those crew members who would have been Jewish would have come ashore, and that's sort of the explanation we get to the tie-in to the Cherokees. So now we got to sort of tie that back into Europe. What were they doing? What were the Templars doing sailing around in the Mediterranean during that time period, and why? And so this is where we start getting in. Like you said, it's sort of an education. And this goes back all the way to the 1100s, the late 1100s, where an Ethiopian prince by the name of Lalibela shows up in Jerusalem. And he was fleeing from his brother named Harbe, who was the king, was trying to kill him. And basically, he found the Templars in Jerusalem, and the Templars, I think because they were looking for the Ark of the Covenant, put Lalibela back on the throne. This is in the 1180s. And they didn't take the Ark of the Covenant back to Europe at that point, even though they did put Lalibela on the throne. It may have been because they didn't want to bring it back there and have to hand it over to the church. Or it may have been the Ethiopians. Later on, we see the Ethiopians sending a delegation to the Pope, beseeching him to allow them to keep the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia. This is like 1306, right before the Templars were outlawed. So we get about 120 years span there. Oh, and by the way, I should mention, the Ark of the Covenant, many historians believe, ended up in Ethiopia. Lots of different possibilities as to why, but having to do with the Queen of Sheba going up to visit King Solomon. This is probably 900 B.C. Sheba gets impregnated by Solomon. Some people think it was a seduction. Other observers think it was sort of a rape. But in any event, she ends up having a son by the name of Melugeon. When Melugeon comes of age, he goes up back to Jerusalem to visit Solomon. Solomon actually welcomes him with open arms and says, "Why don't you stay here?" And Melugeon says, "No, I need to go back and rule in Ethiopia." And so Solomon says, "Okay, you can take back with you the sons of all my best, my cabinet members, basically, my advisors, so that you have advisors of your own to grow old with." The sons are not happy about leaving Jerusalem and being sent down to the backwaters of Ethiopia, and so they come up with a plan to steal the Ark of the Covenant. And when they leave Jerusalem to go to Ethiopia, they take the Ark of the Covenant with them. And that's how many people believe the Ark ended up in Ethiopia. And so the Templars are looking for it. Again, they put Lilibela on the throne. They sort of keep an eye on it. They build these really fascinating underground churches shaped like Templar crosses with underground tunnels all around. But they never actually take the Ark of the Covenant back. Then flash forward to the time period that I was just referring to, the early 1400s. This is now the Portuguese Age of Discovery. Henry the Navigator, who, by the way, is the Grand Master of the Knights of Christ, which is a successor order to the Knights Templar. The Templars have been outlawed. Again, they went underground. They reconstituted themselves, but they didn't disappear. So they're still around, and they're out now, and Henry the Navigator is obsessed with Ethiopia for some reason, even though there's no strategic reason for it, and even though Lalibela is inland, it's not. If you're a sailor, there's no reason really to be there. But he wants to find the Ark of the Covenant, and so this may have been what motivated the Templars to go to Ethiopia, and eventually they end up with the Ark, whether it's then or a little bit later. Now they've got the Ark of the Covenant, and what are you going to do with it? So this gets into my theory. Why not hide it across the Atlantic? No one else knows how to get there. We've got allies and Native Americans there. They will help be custodians of it. What better place to hide your treasures than an unexplored continent across the ocean?
Yeah, I think Lobelia has been mentioned and featured a few times on Ancient Aliens. That made me aware of it.
I'm sorry,
really,
Mark, I'm sorry. What was mentioned? I missed that word. What was mentioned?
Lobelia.
Lalibela. Lalibela. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Lalibela.
Yeah. Lalibela. Okay. And I'm sitting there reading your book, then all of a sudden there's a photo of it, and it's really a fascinating church. It just seems like you'd be walking across this plain, and all of a sudden there's a church below ground in this pit. It's like Ancient Aliens really brought something. Probably a lot of people did not. It was probably more better known by locals and made it like a household name. It's just become one of those places that has been of interest to me since first learning about it. And there it is in your book. And
they really are literally underground. So picture like a elevator shaft dug into the ground, and then built in that shaft is a cross-shaped stone structure that fills up almost the entire shaft, not entirely, and the roof of the church, the structure, is basically at grade. It's at ground level, so it goes down maybe 3 stories deep, 4 stories deep, and then at the bottom there are tunnels connecting these churches, underground tunnels, of course, one to the other. And one of the reasons why you would have done it is because it gets really hot there in the summer, and of course it keeps it cool this way. But I'm not sure what other reasons were, other than you wanted to try to hide them. Maybe I don't know why else you would do it, but they're fascinating, and they're clearly Templar, and they clearly go back to the 12th century. And so the question is, why were the Templars so invested in Ethiopia? There's really no reason strategically, as I said before. The obvious answer is because they were trying to get their hands on the Ark of the Covenant. It could have been gold too. The Ethiopians have vast gold deposits, so it could have been that in exchange for putting Lalibela on the throne, they were given a lot of gold, and that's always the motivation for anybody. But one or the other. And then, by the way, I sort of skipped a step. I mentioned that Templars would have taken the Ark of the Covenant and whatever else they got from Ethiopia and spirited it across to North America. Probably they would have brought it back to Portugal first, and in a place like Tomar or Sintra. We can get into those places at some point later, but there was definitely evidence of structures built in Portugal that were Templar strongholds that could have housed these things before they eventually went across to North America. So we can get into those two if you want, Mark, but that was an important step.
Since we're talking about these underground features, we can get into that it almost looks like a it's a well. I guess it's almost like an inversion of the spiraling Vatican staircase.
Right.
Let's talk about this well that has kind of like a parallel with the underground church.
Right. So it's a uniform spiral. So it's not the Fibonacci sequence. The radius stays the same all the way down, but it goes down, I don't know, 60, 70, 80 feet. It's called an initiation well, and it's at a place called Quinta de Regalera in Sintra, Portugal. And this particular well that's pictured in my book is fairly modern. It's probably only about 150 years old. But next, and then it's a tourist attraction. It's a big tourist attraction. It's a World Heritage Site. The whole place is basically it was built by a wealthy industrialist who was a Freemason, and the whole place is a nod to Masonic and Templar culture and tradition. And this initiation well, I think, was used by the Freemasons as an initiation ceremony site. When they did their initiation ceremonies, they actually used this. What's fascinating is next to it, there's a much older well, similar, not in the same state of repair, that may go back to medieval times, and stemming off from these underground wells or underground tunnels. So it's very similar to what we see in Sintra, and it may be that these were built, this older well may have been built as a place to hide or house the treasures, including the Ark of the Covenant, or whatever, that the Templars found and retrieved from Ethiopia, or maybe from other places in the Middle East. I don't know, but that site in Sintra is fascinating. And then there's also, of course, the stronghold, the Templar stronghold in Tomar, which has a massive fortress, and again is full of Templar symbolism because it's a Templar fortress. But that also may have been a place where their treasures and artifacts were housed. And then at some point when the church turned on them, they decided it's time to get out of Dodge, time to get this stuff out of here and bring it over to North America, where we get better control over it, and we're not at the whims and caprices of the European kings and the Pope and the Vatican and whatnot.
Okay, with just since we're talking about a lot of these European settings at the moment, we kind of do a little segue into something else to let all the listeners process all of your information. But when you were on with Ross Broadstock, he was a guest with us a couple months or so ago. It seems like Ross really enjoys learning about all these stories and the legends, artifacts of Europeans coming to America. And there's some evidence that like Native Americans were going to Europe. He seemed really captivated by your information. Are you encountering, say, like Europeans who also have an interest in these topics?
I'm always surprised, Mark, at the number of books that I sell in England and even Australia, but England, France, the Netherlands, Great Britain, I should say, including Ireland and Scotland and whatnot, but parts of Ireland are not Great Britain, I realize. But I'm always surprised at the number of books that I sell in Europe, because in my mind these are really American stories. But when you think about it, they're not, because I'm talking about Scottish explorers. Basically, Prince Henry Sinclair is Scottish, so that sort of starts the whole thing off in 1398. I'm talking about the Portuguese, for example, in this book. I'm talking about the Freemasons, and they are universal. I'm talking about groups of people who left Europe to come to America, and so Europeans, of course, are interested in that. So you had mentioned something about Native Americans going to Europe. I haven't seen that, but I do have a lot of readers and listeners when I go on these radio shows who are based in Europe, and I shouldn't be surprised by it. I'm not anymore, but at the beginning I was, because again I always think of these things as American stories, but they're really universal stories in many ways.
Yeah, the natives going to England was in Rick Osmond's book, and there was a mural that had people in it's a medieval painting, and they're in the loincloths firing like bows and arrows into like some king that was captured.
Right. I think it's called the Dry Stoke mural, but I might
that's it.
Dry Stoke. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
But and so I've always taken that, and I think the date of that's 1280 or something AD, so it's pre-contact. I've always taken that to be evidence of Europeans being in America. To me, it looks like a European monarch being killed by Native Americans with bows and arrows. I've always taken that to be the story perhaps of Madoc coming here, or other Europeans coming to America and not surviving, and that being memorialized when they got back to Europe. That particular mural is in a church, I believe, in England. But I've always taken that as evidence that the Europeans were in America, not that Indians went to Europe and assassinated a European monarch with their bows and arrows. That to me would be a story that I think we would have been memorialized in Europe, and we would have heard about. So I guess it's possible, but I've always taken that to be something that happened in America and memorialized back in Europe.
Okay, so it was just painted once they returned home.
Right.
From
This is what happened. But it's a very, I've used it in my books before, because it's a very important, given that it's 200 years before Columbus, it's a very important representation of something that happened, and I think they're very clearly Native Americans with the headdresses and the bows and arrows and the loincloths. I mean, there's something going on there, and the monarch is wearing a crown and whatever. It's clearly the clash of two cultures, and so to me, that's what it is: the North American Indians and a clash with a European monarch of some kind.
Okay. So when Richard Thornton
just
was
one more note, by the way. We're talking about the Native Americans and the Indians. I don't want to forget something, because it's worth mentioning, because this is relatively new. I've probably mentioned to you before, but we now have two tribal leaders from different tribes in New England who have gone on the record to say that the Templars were here before Columbus and they built the Newport Tower. So we've got Black Eagle, who's a Pocasset Wampanoag tribal chief from southern Massachusetts, northern Rhode Island, and also Evan Pritchard, who's a Mi'kmaq elder who happens to live in New York State, also verifying the same thing. So again, we've got source, and of course we need to listen to the Native Americans, to the indigenous peoples, because they were here when all this happened. They would know what the history of North America was because they lived through it. So even though they didn't write it down, they don't write down their history. They pass it down orally. It's still sacred to them and important to them and just as valid as any history. But again, in the past few years, we now have two different Native American sources verifying the Templars in America story. I think that's important to note.
Okay. Yeah, and when Richard Thornton was a guest a few weeks ago, did bring up a comment about where he mentions the Walking Dead and Deliverance, and then he went on a little rant about having James Dickey as a college literature professor, and got into a little bit about he was also on the set seeing James film some of the ending of Deliverance. With the setting of Pillars of Enoch and Appalachia, there's some of these trails where Cam is driving through different passages through the mountains to get from Asheville into Tennessee. Richard brings up some of these proposed ancient migration routes towards the Gulf Coast. Is there anything like from those great Southern writers that helped you to get into a frame of mind about writing about Appalachia?
No, but we did drive. My wife and I took a drive down there in past April. As soon as we were vaccinated, we got in the car, and I had been writing the story prior to that, but really couldn't finish it until boots on the ground. Until we had spent 3 or 4 days driving around, getting out of the car, talking to the people. You got to sort of be in the moment if you're going to write about a location. It's one thing to see it on the internet and read a travel book about it, but really to write about a place. So I had outlined a number of chapters, the ones that were written that take place in Asheville, which is really probably most of the book. But the stuff that required to be really descriptive and out in the woods and whatever, I couldn't really write those till I'd done that. So that was it was funny because we were looking forward to some warm weather, leaving Boston in April, and we got down. It was about 50 degrees in Boston. We got to Asheville, it was 31. So it got really cold. The further south we drove, to the point where we were literally freezing in our we didn't dress for it correctly. But anyway, so the answer to your question is no, not really. I didn't really rely on any Southern writers, but I did feel the need to be there in order to write authentically about a place. You got to get out of the car. You got to get down there.
Yeah. Google Earth works for like to develop maybe a paragraph, but like you said, you have to get out of the car to mingle with the people, just look all the way around you at the surroundings.
Right. You know what it's like?
Yeah.
It's like if you and I could have a text conversation, Mark, it wouldn't be nearly as rich as a phone conversation, and that's not as rich as sitting down and having a beer together. Okay, so there's sort of layers of or levels of intimacy or whatever you want to call it, but it's similar when you want to write about a place. Like you said, if you're just writing a paragraph, you can do it through Google Earth, but if you want to write, a few different chapters about a place, you need to be there. And so, and I think most writers would agree with that. It's hard. It's nice to have the internet. It's nice to be able to have Google Earth, but it's no substitute for actually being in a place and all five senses.
Right. Okay. I think hopefully just take your word for the listeners will take your word if they're working on something. It's best to be there if you can. Hopefully we can just inspire people to, if they're down during all these lockdowns, that
Hey,
they can
stop right there, Mark. I don't need the competition. I don't want to be encouraging your listeners to go out and compete with me. No, but seriously, you're right. And kidding aside, I find the act of researching and writing these books to be so much fun. I mean, writing them's great, but even researching is even more fun because basically you get to go down a rabbit hole and spend a few months down there, and by the time you're done, I don't think anybody knows more. I shouldn't say nobody. There's probably only a handful of people who know more about, for example, Melungeon history than I do right now. There's some people, but not many. And that's sort of cool because I didn't even know anything about the Melungeons when I started. And bigger picture, I didn't know anything about the Knights Templar when I started writing the first book in the series, Cabal of the Western Night. And now, again, there's very few people who know more about them than I do, which, for better or for worse. But it's fun as a writer to become, to again, go down the rabbit hole and really go deep into something and then discover things that maybe no one else has discovered. Maybe connect dots in a way that has never been connected before, and then bring that out to the public. That's sort of a gratifying way to spend your day. And again, as much as I love crafting the stories and writing the books themselves, the research itself, the research is even more fun than the writing.
Yeah, and I think that comes across in your novels, and when I have taught, have stressed, what you've been talking about, write about your experiences, what you know best, and just try to avoid just writing stories like the water was wet. It's like, you really don't put the hooks in people about, the cold or the snow was cold. Just hoping that, so some of the listeners just take it from an experienced author to see what it takes to get something of top quality published.
I'm going to make an observation here. This is something that somebody said to me once many years ago, and it's always stayed with me, that you almost need to be schizophrenic to be a successful writer. Because let me explain what I mean by that. On the one hand, and I do this when I do seminars, writing seminars, I say, if you have a large ego, raise your hand. And oftentimes these are how to write seminars, how to write a novel seminars. And very few people raise their hands. And I basically say to them, you're all liars because you wouldn't take this class if you didn't think you had the ability to write the next great American novel. You think you have something unique to say, a book that's never been written before that people are going to want to read. You think you have something really important to say, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And that's great, because that by definition means you have a very healthy ego, a big ego. Okay, otherwise you wouldn't think you could write something. Again, if you go into a bookstore, there's hundreds of thousands of books in a Barnes & Noble. What makes you think you're going to write something that hasn't been said already? But you do, so great, you have a big ego. Good. Now, the problem with that is the first book that you write, I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to suck. And the reason I know that for a fact is because the first time you play the piano, the first time you go ice skating, the first time you kiss a girl, whatever it is, you're probably not going to be any good at it because it's the first time. Well, what makes you think the first book you write is going to be magical? That's crazy. So what you need to do is write it, and then you need to be able to take the criticism. And this is where the big ego becomes a huge problem. People with big egos don't take criticism well, especially when it's something as personal and intimate as a book that they've spent, a year writing, and they've invested hundreds of hours on this. And people with big egos don't take criticism well. And because of that, many authors, I would suggest most authors, never get out of the starting gates because they can't take the criticism of that first book. They can't take the constructive criticism from people who say to them, this isn't working, you need to fix it. Again, their egos are too big. That's why they get into the business to begin with. And so for many people, it's a non-starter. They just can't get it going. You need to both have the big ego, and then you need to man up, put big boy pants on, and take the criticism and work with it constructively and just basically say to yourself, okay, I get it. I understand the first time I go ice skating, I'm not going to be, Bobby Orr, Wayne Gretzky, whatever. But so few people can do that. And so that's an important part of this. If you have to be willing to let people who have done it before point out what's wrong, the flaws with your manuscript. Because, again, I almost guarantee there's going to be huge things that you need to fix and rewrite and redo. And even after all that, your first book's probably not going to be very good. Your second book will be a little better. By the time you get to your third book, okay, now you're probably producing some quality fiction. But you got to get there. You got to swallow your pride through that whole process. And so many people can't seem to make that work. Can't seem to make that happen. Anyway, so that's just something I learned a long time ago, and I try to be really good about when people criticize my work and really try to learn from it, because what's that old expression? You only learn from making mistakes. You don't learn anything from doing something right. You learn from making mistakes.
Dickens's first novel started off being very clumsy, and that was like was it something like by the fourth chapter of the Pickwick Papers.
That was one of the trivia questions tonight. I told you we played trivia tonight. That was one of the questions. Pickwick Papers. What was Dickens' first novel? Good job, Mark. You knew.
Okay. Well, that was just synchronicity with scheduling a show on October 12th or 13th with you too. But I think in the first three chapters he had a first-person narrator, and then all of a sudden he switched over to a third-person narrator for the rest of the book. But that was a beginner's mistake, and when you produce Bleak House and David Copperfield's some of your all-time greatest Victorian novels, you can kind of overlook those youthful mistakes, but it happens.
Right. I mean, once in a while you'll see somebody with a debut novel that's really good, and oftentimes it's not, when it's a debut novel, it's probably not the first novel they've written. It's the first novel that got published. But, good for them. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen. But generally speaking, it's an iterative process. You get better at things as you go along. So the other thing I would say to would-be writers, and we don't have to talk about this too much, but Stephen King wrote about this, the horror writer, the horror genre, Stephen King, that you need to treat it like a job, that if you're going to do it, if it's 5 days a week or 7 days a week, you just need to sit down at the computer and just do it one brick at a time. You can't be like a diva and say, oh, I'm not inspired today, because you wouldn't go into your office job and your boss says, hey, can you work on this project today? And you say, I'm sorry, boss, I'm just not feeling it today. I'm going to go watch TV. No, the boss would say you're fired. So you need to treat your writing job like you would treat your other job. And so you can't basically say to yourself, well, I've got writer's block, I'm not inspired, I'm waiting for inspiration. No, you don't get to do that. If you want to be a writer, then you have to treat it like any other job, and it has to be every day, however many hours you want to put aside for it. And it can be your second job, and you could say, I'm only going to do 2 hours a day. It's my second job. But whatever it is, it has to be scheduled. You have to be disciplined. If for some reason you really can't write that day, then you can do research, you can do editing, you can do proofreading. There's other things you can do. But you need to treat it like you would any other job. And that's really the only way to get through it. So that was an interesting piece of advice Stephen King gave, which I always try to follow. When I'm writing, I write every day. I never take a day off. No, I may only spend a half hour, but that allows me to keep stacking bricks so that eventually my wall is finished. And secondly, equally as important, is that allows my brain to stay engaged in the project. And I never get to that point where I've taken 3 or 4 days off and it's hard to find the thread of my story again. If I'm working on it every day, even for just a half hour, it's easy the next day to pick it up again, and I never lose it. So again, if you're going to do it, those are pieces of advice that I was given that I found useful, and I'll pass them along tonight.
Okay, yeah, are you finding that during the last almost 2 years that more people are writing and researching about biblical mysteries and their interpretations of the rod of Aaron or
I have not
UFOs
noticed
in
that,
the Bible?
but you're closer to that than I am, Mark, because you're out there interviewing all the time. I have not noticed that, but that may be a product of the pandemic too, that more people are spending time, have time on their hands, and they're going down on the internet and going down these rabbit holes and exploring things they wouldn't normally have time to explore. So I haven't noticed that, but I wouldn't be surprised. Two reasons. One, of course, the pandemic, but secondly, I think people are looking more critically now at some of the things that we've been taught, some of the Old Testament stories. There's basically the Old Testament. There's so many stories in the Old Testament, but we see basically hear the same stories over and over again, and there's a lot of obscure stuff in there that you look at it and go, what's going on there? Pardon me, sneeze. Pardon me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, I was just wondering. I think we've probably had, Barbara and I have been contacted by more people who have religious-oriented books that they've written for years. So I was just wondering if you noticed that too. But what? Let's see. What kinds of other questions? Have you learned anything new about Atlantis? Has any new information come to light? I think that's. I enjoyed your book on echoes of Atlantis, and especially learning the phrase nostophilia.
That's good. That's a good memory, Mark. So, yeah, not too much. There was actually some fascinating research about the possibility of Atlantis being in the deserts of Africa, which is really, I happened to be giving a lecture one night at a Masonic lodge, and two different Masonic brothers at different times of the night came up to me with the same information, and they didn't even know each other. They were from different lodges. But basically that there was a documentary about the possibility of Atlantis being in the deserts of Western Africa. And I haven't really gotten deep into that just because I was busy researching other stuff at the time. But that's different than my conclusion that it was along the along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And when you mention nostophilia, it's the memory of it is the instinct to return to your homeland, the nostalgia to return to your ancient homeland. So in the case in my book, I've mentioned the eels of North America and the eels of Europe, both, even though they're freshwater animals, swim into the Atlantic Ocean when it's time to breed and end up meeting at a place called the the Sargasso Sea in the Middle Atlantic. Again, this instinct to go back to their native homeland. And I'm glad you remembered that word, Mark. That's a good one. But no, other than the Africa thing, I haven't seen anything new on Atlantis. But there has been some continues to be updated stuff. You mentioned Oak Island earlier, and so the book I mentioned to Barbara off the air before we started tonight, that literally 20 minutes before I went on the air tonight, I finished my first rewrite of my next novel in the series, the title of which is Sheba's Revenge, Oak Island, and the Templar Treasure. We talked about Queen Sheba earlier tonight, briefly about how she went to visit King Solomon and ended up becoming pregnant by him. And the idea of Sheba's revenge is the fact that Menelik, her son, ended up stealing the Ark of the Covenant, or not stealing, but being part of the theft of the Ark of the Covenant. And that how does that play forward 3,000 years from now? How does that possibly relate to the Oak Island mystery and, of course, the Templars? And so, by now, Mark, what I do is I take things. So in the case of the Pillars of Enoch, we've got the Blue Star prophecy. We've got the mystery at the heart of Freemasonry. We've got this whole idea of the Melungeons perhaps being of mixed racial ethnicity. We've got the Templars, of course, traveling through Ethiopia, trying to get the Ark of the Covenant. You put all those together, you take those ingredients, you mix them all together, and you come up with a story. In this particular case, in the latest book, I've got the Sheba story, again, the potential of the lost Ark of the Covenant. But in this particular case, I look at maybe what the Templars are doing in Ethiopia was getting the gold. And then I tie that in, of course, with the mysteries of Oak Island. Everyone's interested in that. Everyone loves a treasure hunt. And, twist all these around and throw them together and see if I can come up with a plot that where all those subplots join together. And so that was fun because I haven't really done Oak Island. I did a little bit of Oak Island in the very first book, Cabal of the Western Night, but I haven't revisited it since. I'm not sure how often you have guests who talk about Oak Island, but it's sort of, in some ways it's overdone, and I didn't really think I had anything fresh to add. But then I found some really cool research that hasn't really been talked about too much that I thought I could do some interesting things with and offer insights into that evidence that hadn't been offered before. So, do you do a lot of Oak Island on your show? I haven't heard you do it before, but
no, it's really not Oak Island. You and Rob Sullivan, quite a few, Ahmed Osman, some of the our regulars do write pretty frequently about Masonic information. Bill Mann is another one.
Right.
So they are contacting us to let us know. Oh, hey, I got another book coming out. Some aspect of the Masons' treasures from the Holy Land. We really haven't done much specifically on Oak Island, other than maybe just an occasional reference. Bill's information is probably the closest that we've gotten to Oak Island.
Yeah, there's for the past couple of years, there's been some interesting journals floating around that may or may not be authentic. But one of the things that the journals say is that the Templars did deposit their treasures someplace up in the Nova Scotia area, perhaps Oak Island, perhaps a different island, and that right before the Revolutionary War, a group of Freemasons from either Philadelphia or Boston, depending on which account you read, traveled up to Nova Scotia to retrieve the treasure and use that treasure to fund the American Revolution. And that's sort of a cool story. It resonates in a couple different ways because, some people think that the Templars were coming here to build what is referred to as the New Jerusalem, as a place where Templar ideals, liberty, the value of the individual person, separation of church and state, some of the things that they may have believed in, that those things could take root. That was one of the reasons why, according to some, one of the reasons why the Templars were here. And so the idea that hundreds of years later, their treasure would have been used by the Founding Fathers, many of whom were Freemasons, to fund the Revolution sort of makes sense. It sort of puts a nice bow on things, makes things come full circle. It's a kind of story that, as a writer, I would like to write. That's a happy ending to the story. That everything comes around to its natural conclusion point. So I think we'd like to believe that, because it sort of resonates in many ways. I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it did make for a fun angle in the book I'm just finishing up right now, which will be out again in late November, Sheba's Revenge. But it's interesting how that Oak Island show continues to draw huge audiences, even though they really never seem to find much up there. They find occasionally they find some interesting stuff, but the number of hours I spent watching that show where they didn't find anything, so I sort of want a refund on some of that. But we all keep watching it. We all, once a week, put on our either tape it or put it on live and make sure to watch it. Do you watch that show? Are you one of the? Because I do. I watch it every week. Do you watch it?
I watch it sporadically.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with it, but it is an interesting story.
So I read this quote recently, and I don't want to get it right, but every old man wants to find within himself the little boy that believes in the lost treasure. I thought it was a great quote. I forget where it came from, but that's sort of the allure of Oak Island. We all of us old men want to go back to that time when we were 11 years old, looking for treasure in the woods or in the stream behind our house or underneath the floorboards in the basement, or up in the attic or something. So every old man wants to find within himself the little boy who believes in the lost treasure. And that's why we watch Oak Island. Curse of Oak Island.
I like it.
Yeah.
And we're down to about 5 minutes. I think tonight's one of those examples of while you're having these 2-hour discussions with you is probably why I'm in unemployed English teacher, but I have helped to make Barbara 7 cents from our Rumble account.
There you go.
But schools really aren't interested in hiring people who are able to talk about Templars and Giants and Göbekli Tepe. So, but I'm content doing these shows with you. It's fun.
Well, look, we talked about the liberal arts education and how it actually does come in handy for doing what I do, which is researching these books, but also doing what you do, conducting these interviews. If you didn't know a lot about a lot of things, Mark, you couldn't do the interviews. You really can. You need to be a Renaissance man to do what you do. And so, so maybe you're not an English teacher, but I have a feeling you enjoy yourself, and
it's fun.
Yeah, and good for you. I mean, you do a good job at it. So it's a real public service.
Okay, thank you. And I think you have some terrific novels, and Barbara and I will have you back for your new book on Oak Island. And
thank you.
And we're down to about 2 minutes. So do you want to give everyone your website and any other plug anything else, and we'll call it a night?
Yeah, so website davidbrodybooks.com. It's Brody. There are 12 books in this series called the Templars in America series. There's 3 in something called the Boston Law series. We didn't talk about that stuff at all, but this series, these are fiction, but they're based on fact. So I occasionally get listeners who say, I only read nonfiction. Let me just say to you, we just talked for 2 hours about the history and the hard evidence that go into these books. Please don't avoid these books because you don't like fiction. I mean, the fiction is there, but trust me, there's a lot of history and evidence and science in these stories, and I think you'll enjoy the fictional part as well. But the other thing I want to say is I try to make these affordable. They're only $15 each. They're $4 and change for the Kindle. This stuff is my passion, and if I really wanted to make money, I could practice law, which I don't do anymore. I do this because this is my passion. This is what keeps me up at night. And so I want people to read this stuff. I want you to get hooked on the series, and I want you to send me an email and ask me questions, and I want you to call me up and say, hey, there's a carving in my grandfather's backyard. Can I send you a picture? Because that's how I find new sites and new artifacts to write about. So, again, for me, it's all about getting as many people as we can interested in this hidden history, interested in the things that we didn't learn about in school. And that's why I do what I do, and also why I do these talks, and people like Mark are so helpful to help spread the word, because in the end, that's what's going to allow us to figure out what really happened in America before Columbus. So thank you, Mark, for having me on tonight. I appreciate it very much.
Oh, thanks for the terrific show, Dave. We'll be talking, have you back and do this all over again sometime soon. We're just about out of time. And thank you, everyone. I'll see you next Tuesday. Take care, everyone. Have a good week.